So I'd like to thank you all for braving the weather and coming out this afternoon. I don't know what the weather was like this morning. My flight was about an hour delayed, and I'm sure it's probably had an impact on the education day today because it sounds like it was a little nasty this morning. I'm Bob Stoltz. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing with Gemline. And the presentation we're going to go through today is really just about change. We cover a lot of different areas, and I'll kind of quickly walk through an agenda. But really what we do is this is a presentation that really started with Jonathan Isaacson, our president, who I like to say is a frustrated economist. Jonathan subscribes to a service called Haver Analytics. He gathers information from The Economist. He constantly is evaluating economics, trends that he sees in the marketplace, just things that are going on, and then from a business standpoint tries to determine how that's going to impact us at Gemline and probably more often what impact that will have on our industry in promotional products. It was a presentation that was used mostly internally. Ted Simpson has probably seen this more than he'd care to admit. But it is a presentation that changes constantly. And a couple of years ago, Jonathan gave this presentation at the ASI Power Summit in 2010. And it was the most controversial presentation of the Power Summit, without question. So since then, there's been a lot more demand for this. And now we update it on an ongoing basis. So there's a lot of information in here that's new for this year. We have a small group, which is great. I encourage you to make this very interactive. I'm going to put a lot of numbers up there, a lot of charts up there. We'll roll through some of it fairly quickly, but if there's things you have questions about, certainly stop me and we can discuss it at that point. We don't have answers. We just want to provoke thought. I mean, I'll give you sometimes the view that we have of some of the information that we're presenting. But certainly it's subject to your interpretation. So some of the things we're going to cover. I'm going to quickly run through some slides that just sort of a trend watching in 2012 and what we saw out there and the sorts of changes we saw. Then we're going to talk about the economy, the industry, demography around the world. And then we're going to transition from those demographics into specifically impact on China, which obviously has a big impact on our industry. I'm going to talk a little bit about compliance, and we're going to finish with some information on a move to mobile. So I'm going to go, as I said, I'll go through these slides fairly quickly, but these are just things that certainly we're all seeing out in the marketplace. Computing devices are being completely reimagined with the launch of the iPad in April of 2010. So while there are certainly plenty of laptops and notebooks out there, much more of our work is now being done on tablets and smartphones. This is a trend that we watch very closely at Gemline because it directly impacts the products we have, the size of those products, and what kind of trends we're going to see in those products. But this really impacts everyone. It's a world increasingly that is in touch all the time. And we'll talk about that as we go through some of the charts later in the presentation. Evolution of note-taking. I'm going from a pencil and a notepad to all sorts of note-taking software and applications that are available on those mobile devices, including just talking to Siri and asking her to put your notes in your iPhone, and then you can search that iPhone for those notes. Again, big impact on our product. We look at our traditional Padfolio volume, and you can see traditional Padfolios screaming down, and you can see Padfolios that integrate the technology, that carry an iPad, that have a place for the iPhone, dramatically increasing. News and information flow. And this you can see as you see global events around the world. The first reports from almost anything today come from people not news agencies, people who are experiencing those events firsthand. Jonathan grabbed a pic here from a plane that went down in the Hudson, and the Twitter feed from a gentleman who was going to their aid right away. The catastrophe in Newtown, Connecticut, just this past December. All the early reports were texts and Twitter feeds, and so part of the accuracy of some of the early information was certainly in question, because the reporting is being done by the people who are living through the experience. Reimagination of manufacturing. We've got a couple of things that are pretty significant out there. We've got Zazzle and Cafe Press and Vistaprint, all sorts of places where now you can personalize traditional consumer products in a quantity of one. Hard to say what impact that's going to have on us. Right now the cost of doing that is very expensive, but it certainly is a significant trend. And there's a 3D printing process out there that now allows you to make product in a quantity of one. It literally lays layer after layer after layer of material together and creates a product. Oops. Okay. And then reimagination of life stories. And again, something that I think is having a real impact on our industry. You meet people and learn about people through their social media. I have a little story about this. I have two daughters, and I'll refer to them a couple of times in the presentation because they provide sort of my gauge of the rate of change that's going on. But about 5 years ago, I was one of the, among business people and certainly adults of my age, and some of you are not quite as old as I am, but similar age, I was one of the early adopters of Facebook, primarily to get on and see what was going on with my two daughters, who at the time were in their teens. One of my younger daughter's friends said to me about 3 months after I was on Facebook, "Mr. Stoltz, I thought it was kind of creepy that you were on Facebook. Till I looked at the number of friends you had, and you have more than Lindsay." We're an industry where Facebook is very prevalent. I'm not sure how prevalent in Canada versus the US, but in the US, there are many, many, many customers that I've not met except through Facebook. And it's like we are friends. I was corresponding with one over the weekend. She had taken we had a great picture of her taken at the PPAI show in Las Vegas. We wanted to put it on our Facebook. I bounced it past her just to make sure it was okay. She wanted some self-promotion product. We did all sorts of things over the weekend. I've never met her. I don't have a lot of customers. I don't like to think that have a lot of customers I've never met, but we are a very fragmented industry. And the social media changes allow us to really increase not only our reach, but the rate at which we develop relationships. So just with those early opening slides, going to transition to the economy and how the economy impacts on our industry. This is sort of the gemline view. And Jonathan's view just changed last week. He's certainly a little more confident than I am. We were both sort of 50% chance of moderate growth this year and 20% chance of recession. He's now on the 80% track of moderate growth. I think there's still a lot of unknown out there. The fiscal cliff, while we've dodged a bullet for now, is still out there. Obamacare is out there. There's a lot of things going on in the world, in the international markets that are going to have an impact. Europe is still a mess. All that being said, I think there's a pretty solid consensus in our industry that we're likely to see a year somewhat like last year, which I don't think anyone's published their numbers yet, but I understand that both industry associations will come out somewhere around 5 or 5.5% growth. So we're still very much in a recovery mode from the deepest recession and longest in duration recession since the Great Depression. We are coming up on 5 years. First quarter of 2008 is when, and this chart shows percentage of job losses from since World War II and in recessions. It shows the percent of job losses and the duration that it took to get back to the previous level of employment. The red line is our current recession. All the other recessions back to 1948 generally are deeper, or deep in a trough but fairly short in duration, or not fairly shallow, and this is the 2001 recession, fairly shallow but a little bit longer in duration. None have been as deep or as long as this recession. We're coming up on 5 years. The Great Depression lasted, depending on where you pick your barometer, 10 or 11 years. We're halfway, in terms of duration, we're halfway through. Certainly not at the same level of severity, but we've still got a long way to go to get back to the job picture that we had prior to this downturn. These are the changes in employment numbers during that recessionary time period. So starting in January of 2008 and just walking across, you can see the impact of the recession here, the financial collapse, the downturn, the recovery that started a little bit of a double dip. And then since then, pretty consistently, jobs being added on a regular basis. And I've got, obviously, mostly U.S. data. I've got a little bit of Canadian data that I'll mix in here where we had some available. Just for fun, Jonathan likes to look at automobile sales. And it is a good idea to have another indicator that you're tracking at the same time. And automobile sales actually have the closest relationship to those same employment numbers. You see the little spike there, that's the outlier. That's the clunkers for cash program, where it actually did stimulate car sales during that time period. But otherwise, what you see is a trend line that generally follows the rate at which jobs are added back into the economy. This is an incredible direct relationship that we have tracked for a long time. The red line is the promotional product change in sales, period by period, matched up to jobs being added or lost. That red line sitting at the top of those blue bars is about as close to a direct relationship as you can find. So we really very much follow whatever is going on in terms of large companies adding or laying off employees. And it makes sense. I used to use the phrase, we define the term discretionary spend. We're one of the first things that can be taken out of a budget. And because of the smaller nature of the spend on an event-by-event basis, one of the first things that can be added back. So here's some Canadian numbers. Canada did not see as deeper a trough in their, or deep an employment drop in their numbers, but by the same token, hasn't exactly had a terribly consistent recovery. It's been fairly consistently jobs being added with an occasional period where there's some job loss mixed in. This is auto sales matched up against those same numbers. Actually, what would appear to be a more direct relationship to job changes than we saw in the U.S. Would love to have the Canadian promotional product market numbers in this same time frame, but I talked to Chantal. They were only available on an annual basis, so we really can't trend it. But when you look at the auto sales numbers and you look at the U.S. sales numbers, it would be hard to imagine that you don't have the same impact in Canada. When companies are adding jobs, they're buying more promotional products. When they're releasing employees, they are buying fewer promotional products. And this is the chart that sort of started the controversy at the Power Summit a couple of years ago. It's a pretty straightforward chart. It is the ASI, and we can use either ASI or PPI numbers. We've done both. It is just the total industry reported number by year for basically the last, at this point, 21 years. And the only statement made was, in the 1990s, there was growth, and from 2000 forward, we basically show all evidence of being a mature market. There is no additional growth in this market. You can point to a little uptrend in the mid-2000s, adjusted by a recession, but again, we follow the economic cycle, which really defines maturity in a marketplace. If what you do is you don't grow, you just go up and down based upon the current economic cycles, your market is mature. And we're talking about a 10 or 11-year time period, not a short time period. So the basic statement, there is no growth left in the industry. If we want to grow, we need to do it ourselves. We're going to talk a little bit about demography. So I'm going to shift gears here. Birth rates are declining around the world. In places where you wouldn't expect it to decline, I'm always surprised to see that in Africa, the average birth rate is declining. Western Europe, United States, makes a little more sense. China, a little bit surprising on there, and we're going to talk a lot more about that. And because of that, we have a significantly slower growth in the working age population. So the blue lines show prior to 2010, the previous 40 years, and the percentage of jobs that were added, or the percentage of population that was added in the working age between 20 and 65. The red bars show what is being projected for the same number for the next 40 years. So you've got some places where, again, China, by this estimate, will have fewer working age people. And I'm going to go through some additional numbers that will, I think, pretty much confirm this. There will be fewer people of working age in China in the next 40 years. It's going to drop. South Korea, some of these not necessarily very impactful on us, but certainly interesting. Canada is, according to this analysis, going to be flat. There will be no additional working age population added during that time period. And some of the places where you see decreases, you perhaps expect those given the birth rate chart.
What is the working age population?
The number of people between the age of 20 and 65. So in the U.S., what we're seeing is a slow growth in new entrants to the workforce. Probably, honestly, not a big concern. You see the impact of the baby boom during this time period, and you see it basically flattening out after that. In a period of strong economic growth in the U.S., there will be great demand for talent, and it will be harder to retain talent. And I know, sociologically, we wonder about, again, when I say we, in my age group, in the baby boomer, end of the baby boomer age group, we wonder about younger people who change jobs frequently and consistently during their career. In a marketplace where there are few new people entering the workforce, you're going to have that kind of movement. There's going to be a lot of demand for talent. So we'll work smarter and with fewer employees, and that's probably going to be fine both in Canada and the U.S. But what about where our products are produced? This is the fertility rate in China all the way back to 1955. You'd have to have a fertility rate of 2.1 to keep your population static, to not lose population. A mother or a father need to have 2 kids plus 0.1 for early mortality and things like that. China has actually operated below 2, has been experiencing a birth rate below 2 for a little while. And if you think that drop is all the one-child rule, actually That drop started before the one-child policy was announced in 1979. So culturally, there was a change in China that drove a lower birth rate before the one-child policy was announced. And this shows the impact. So throughout the decade up to 2010, or in the current decade, there's a little bit of growth rate in the working age population in China, and then after that, it starts dropping. In an interesting chart next to it, the percentage of elderly in China in about 12 or 15 years, the percentage of Chinese who are elderly will actually be a higher percentage than in the US. And we always talk about the aging baby boomers in the US and all the social programs it takes and things like that to support that. In China, they will have a higher percentage than the US will. And for the most part, at least today in China, those elderly are cared for by their children. That's pretty much the culture. And somewhere in the next 5 years, or perhaps a little longer, India will actually pass China in total population. So China will no longer be the largest country in the world in terms of population. So here's sort of a summary of that demographic change. In the next decade, the people in the 20 to 24 age group in China will drop by 50%. If you walk through a factory in China today, you can assume that in the next 10 years, half that number will still be working. And there are other changes driving it that might mean less than that, because they're finding different types of jobs other than the core manufacturing that we do. China has 118 boys for 100 girls. I always say that just means there's a lot of frustrated boys. Expectations for the new class have changed. The one-child policy and a different world, a standard of living that is consistently increasing in China. Asia in total, for the first time in 2011, passed both the US and Western Europe in the number of millionaires in their population and the number of billionaires in the population. There is more wealth in Asia now than in any other continent in the world. So China's never going to be the same. It's going to change from an exporter to a consumer. Already is. You can already see that change happening. It's going from rural to urban. The younger people are being drawn to Shanghai and all the big cities along the coast. It's going from poor to rich, and it's going from weak to strong. During this same time period, or during the current time period, the Chinese currency is also getting stronger and stronger against the US dollar. And wage rates, and this is all the different provinces, but consistently, wage rates across those provinces are going up and going up dramatically. So what that means is we will see a big supply chain shift. Product being produced in China today is going to have to go someplace else. You've got all these changes working together. Fewer workers, a higher class of living among those workers, rapidly increasing inflation. You're going to see a significant dispersal of supply chain, where the products are going to come from. And there's no place short of India where it can move that to one country. I mean, it's such a massive source of product that it's going to be broken up among many, many countries. A daunting, exciting statistic or exciting prospect for some people who look at each one of those changes and say, in this, if you move quickly enough, you'll benefit from it. But for those that don't have the resources or don't have the adaptability to move their supply chain very effectively, this will be a troubling time. This will make the move when products move from the U.S. and other Asia countries, like higher cost countries like Japan and Korea, to China, this will be a much more disruptive change because it's moving from one big, very efficient source to a lot of different places. And I say, except for India, and part of the reason I say that is India already is at a higher cost than China and has a also rapidly advancing standard of living. So with all that, you can expect price increases in China. There's core inflation, there's currency exchange, there's cost of labor, there's the lack of availability of labor, raw material increases, and always the cost of compliance. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We don't spend very much time on the compliance section in this piece, but we operate in a world of fear, really starting, and I use as a baseline 9/11. If you were a child, my kid's age, at that time, that's what you remember. That's your benchmark. That's the thing. You know, when in my age, we think about the day Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. You know, everybody has these benchmarks. The population moving into the workforce today benchmarks off of 9/11. My oldest daughter is teaching in Kuwait at the American International School of Kuwait. She just went there this year. She's in her first year of her contract. And I have traveled internationally pretty extensively throughout my career. So when Stacy got the job in Kuwait, I let it settle for 6 or 8 weeks, and then I said, you know, we need to have a conversation about personal safety, about the things you can do to assure you're safe when you're working there. And she proceeded to tell me, well, what I've done so far is I've registered with the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait. They have my home address where I'll be living. I've MapQuested the route from my home to the U.S. Embassy. I have the names of about 10 or 12 cab drivers from other teachers in Kuwait already that I know are safe to use and reliable. She went through this list, and I thought I had traveled in a number of countries where certainly questionable. I was in Colombia during the mid-'90s and late '90s. I was with, at the time, Sanford, and we had a business in Colombia. I never registered with the U.S. Embassy. Never even occurred to me to register with the U.S. Embassy. The reason I go through this little story is that's the mindset of people entering the workforce. So this is an example of that. But the National Banking Act, setting up the banking system, is 29 pages. The Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve, is 32 pages. The Glass-Steagall Act, which basically created a wall between the commercial banking side and investment banking side, was 37 pages. The Dodd-Frank Act, in response to the financial collapse in 2009, is 848 pages. So it is an environment where there's a level of fear among the population, and that will just increase, and there will be more and more compliance moves. What's that mean? We're not going to go through all this in detail, but I'm going to show you 2 charts that basically make up Gemline's compliance matrix. These are the statutes that we test to and measure to and set up our supply chain perspective around, and what we measure. So lead, other heavy metals, including cadmium, phthalates. And the standards are CPSIA, Prop 65, the Canadian Consumer Product Safety Act, LPPA, which is a smaller statute in Illinois around lead protection. But these are all the things you have to test for. They're all different levels that you have to measure. In the case of Prop 65, they're settlement limits. So what you really have to track is, because Prop 65 doesn't say it's okay to have lead, they say no lead's allowed, and then products are settled at levels that basically sort of set the standard. This is the second matrix, which really sort of takes in all the other things, where third-party testing is required, what products we have that are affected, the materials that are involved, and a lot of other, some of them are the CPSIA standards, but a lot of other standards that the products have to comply with. The reason I show the two matrices is it's complicated, it's big, and it requires a small village to maintain. And not everyone can do this. But it is an environment where this will continue to increase. And we will have to have products that comply to these standards. So now I'm going to get into a little bit more of the fun stuff, the move to mobile. Mobile communication is a way of life, and it's going to become more of a way of life. If you have kids the age of my kids or younger, you're seeing the impact of that now. In 2012, 10% of the households with children under 12 had iPads versus 3% of all the other households.
Is that North stats?
These are preteens. I'm going to assume it's U.S. stat, but I don't know. The reference doesn't actually indicate it. So, but the point being, if you have children, you're more likely to have an iPad than if you don't. Half of all 11-year-olds own their own cell phone. Again, I talk about my two daughters at this stage. They believe email is something you use to move data, not communicate. I've got a daughter in Kuwait, as I mentioned. I've got another daughter at the University of Denver. We Skype, we text. I can't remember the last time I received an email from either one of them. That's just not the way they communicate. Live, interactive, expect immediate response. I have customers now, for the first time, really have customers that don't operate off of email at all. I receive texts. We text back and forth, we send things via text, and occasionally have a phone conversation or meet at a show. But when you run into people you're selling to who are in that 20 to, let's say, 35 age bracket, you're going to increasingly run into a different form of communication. iPad revenue, just the iPad, not Apple revenue, iPad revenue by itself will soon eclipse total Dell revenues. So it will pass up what was the largest laptop producer not too many years ago. And just to show the level of disruption that can occur as these changes occur, we point to the newspaper industry. So I actually looked at these numbers this morning, and it hit me that in the next 2 years, the promotional product industry will pass, in the US, will pass the total newspaper advertising market size. It fell to around $20 million last year or the year before. We're sitting at 18 million, let's say, when the numbers are published this year, or something maybe a little higher than that. Our industry will be bigger than newspaper advertising. Possibly already is, because we haven't seen the 2012 numbers. This is obviously, how many people in here read a newspaper? How many read it daily? I was always a newspaper guy. I didn't start my day without looking at the newspaper. I haven't opened a newspaper in 2 years. When I checked in today at the hotel, he said, "Do you want a newspaper?" And I said, I just thought, and I said, I don't know what I'd do with it. I get all my news off the iPad. It's a disruptive influence, and obviously this is a big example of the disruption that can occur, but we should be prepared for that kind of disruption. So this goes back and says the internet surpassed newspaper ad revenue in 2010. I think it's more amazing to think that we will sell more promotional products than there will be newspaper advertising sold pretty quickly. This goes back, and perhaps not a big surprise to anyone, the number of mobile phones passed landlines 10 years ago. That number just keeps increasing, and now more and more you see homes, at least residences, that don't even have a landline, that operate solely off a mobile phone. I suspect we'll see the same thing in businesses. So with all that, selling in the new world, and what does it mean to us? A quote from Death of a Salesman: "Today it's all cut and dried. There's no chance for bringing friendship to bear or personality." So the challenge is we've got more competition, more distraction, a new generation and a move to mobile within that, more distrust or fear perhaps in the compliance area, and our market is mature. These are not small challenges. To give evidence of that, what I've talked about a couple of times in terms of that communication, and I don't know the size of these circles, I just put these circles up there. There's a group of customers who want to email today. There's a group of customers who want to speak live or by phone. There's some who want to text, web text, or chat. There's probably bigger, much bigger intersections of those who use some combination of these forms of communication. But you should be prepared fairly soon for a much bigger circle of those who want to text or web chat, a much smaller portion who want to email, and if they do email, it will be to move data. And again, some will always and should continue to want to speak live or by phone. And I put this up here just because it happened last week, and it was a perfect example for the point that I'm making. This is right off of our web chat system on my Gemline, and I grabbed each of the elements. So in March of last year, this particular customer set up their own account, gave us an ASI or PPAI number, set it up on my Gemline. In August, they came in via web chat, said they were looking at an item, wanted to know the pricing, wanted to know how quickly we could ship it, and in the same web chat said, PO's on its way. A few days later, associated with the same order, basically clarified the order via web chat. We've not spoken to the customer yet. Everything's being done by web chat, clarifying a few things. Satisfied, got it, thanks, appreciate your help, 10:49 a.m. January 10th, just a week or 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I'm pitching to a client tomorrow afternoon for 22,000 units. It's on a duffel bag. Ended up being 26,000 units and a $136,000 order. I've ordered samples for 3 of the sport bags already had presented them to the customer. What would be the cost as an ASI member for the 22,000? Your bag prices only go up to 1,000 pieces. I can almost sense the disappointment in that phrase. If we had given him pricing for 22,000 on the internet or via the web chat, via the web, I suspect he never would have talked to us. But I was hoping someone could contact me to discuss. And he gave his phone number at the end of that web chat. So we talked to the customer for the first time, and 5 days later, we have a $136,000 order. And that customer probably would have placed that business without ever meeting with us, without ever speaking with us. Not necessarily the way any of us want to do business, but it is a way that people are going to do business in the future. It's the way I imagine my daughters would do business. So how do you get through to the new generation? This is a little bit of my Facebook pitch, and I see my Sanford guys back there laughing. I'm not sure what they're laughing about. A couple of years ago, I said to the Sanford team, you should be on Facebook. I understand, you can decide if you really want to. You can decide if you're comfortable with it, but you should be on Facebook. I'd encourage you to get out there. This last year, we finally got our last salesperson on Facebook. I don't know how many of the Canadians are on Facebook, but it's not optional anymore. If you aren't building relationships via social media, your competitor is. The speed with which they build those relationships is unbelievable. We talked about it in a couple of the previous slides early on. You learn about their kids. You learn who their pet is. You learn that Bob does yoga. You learn all these things so quickly, you gain an advantage over the person who is not Facebook connected. So you've got to be out there. You've got to prepare yourself to text for business. I've got a customer in San Francisco who I text with my daughters. I don't really text for business. All of his communication, and he's the principal, he's the owner of the firm, all his communication is via text. And I look back at my string of texts with Zach just last week when I was preparing for this, and I had one where he had asked me for some information. It took me 2.5 hours to respond. Had it been an email, I looked at that and I said, if that had been an email to me coming across my iPhone, I would have responded within 20 minutes. You're going to have to get better. I'm going to have to get better at responding to that sort of communication. Are you selling differently or just selling different products? The types of products, as we've talked about a couple of times, are changing. But more importantly, the world is changing, and the way you separate yourself is changing. So it's important to sell differently in addition to selling different products. Are you selling on price or are you selling on customer value? All these things that you bring in terms of customer value, impact, creativity, effectiveness, reliability, safety, the compliance issue, quality, service, on-time delivery, domain knowledge. All these things are really critical. If you're selling on price, they can get that via web chat. And as we just saw evidence of, they will. You have to decide your strategy and you have to decide trade-offs. Picture of the MacBook Air, which is an incredibly light unit. I also carry an Ultrabook, not the MacBook Air. But an incredibly light unit, but has given up something in operating speed and in memory capacity. But Apple decided this is the space we're going to carve. This is what we're going to create. They obviously were very successful with it, which is why the traditional Windows laptop manufacturers are now responding with Ultrabooks. In the mobile phone industry, Apple doesn't sell the most phones yet. But this is the operating profit driven by each of the major players. And that big purple line that keeps getting bigger, that's Apple. So what they've defined with their handset unit is the type of customer they're going after and a type of customer that does not respond to price competition. If you want an iPhone, you're going to get an iPhone. It doesn't matter what you're going to pay for it. And it's coming through in their operating profits. So as you think about this, think about whether you're an account exec or a supplier rep, what are the values that you bring? Ideally with an account exec, you hope, or we hope, the types of account exec we target at Gemline are people who are creative. They have a deep domain understanding of a vertical market and the end users in that market, and the ability to understand what the marketing objectives are and the program or demographic. What's the hook? What's the razzle-dazzle? How do you stand out? Understand your customer, understand your customer's customer, and know why you would be selected. Recognize the value that you bring. Ensure the value is clear and essential. It's a place where we were not as strong. We've really sort of rejiggered our own marketing efforts to more clearly define how Gemline is different than other suppliers in the marketplace. Be responsive, easy, pleasant to do business with. If you can't do those things, you're selling on price, and it's not a very pretty future. So again, you need clarity. You need to define your essence. You need to know who you are. Time is your most limited resource. One of the things we encourage account execs who work with Gemline is select your customers carefully. Determine where you're going to spend your time and make sure they're a good fit for the types of value that you're offering. By the same token, select your suppliers carefully. Select the suppliers that are a good match with the value equation that you bring to your customers. Profitable strategies, just a manufacturing study from a few years ago that show the average return on sales highest for those that whose core competency is around innovation, next for those whose core competency is around customer service, and lowest for those who are basically the low-cost manufacturer. They still make money, but that is their equation, and they basically provide a lower average return on sales. Just a few things to finish up with. I think I used the ASI chart. We could use the same information from PPAI. Promotional products are a very low cost per impression investment for end users. So we still have that as an advantage against most other types of media spend. Really everything except social media, internet types of combination. Duration of the length of time that promotional products are kept obviously impact positively those cost per impression numbers. And when you stack it up in terms of granularity, how well targeted the campaign can be and what the cost of the campaign is, again, promotional products are very high on that chart, second only to web or social media. We could do a whole nother presentation on how you can make promotional products a good tie with a customer's social media and web initiatives. The power of the word free is more powerful on the web than any place else. So if they're giving away a product, if they want to drive Facebook friending, there's nothing like offering something for free. And so I think there's a lot of, we have multiple examples of this, but a great opportunity for promotional products in that area. And I mentioned advertising media spend. The fact that newspaper in 2011 fell to about $20 million. We're sitting at that time at 17. Their number continues to go down. Our number continues to go up. We're passing that. But more importantly, the percentage change continues to be in a recovery area within a recession. A 7% increase in 2011, not quite as high in 2012, but a pretty good number compared to everything up there, except internet, which obviously is growing leaps and bounds. So this is sort of the finish. This is one of my favorite Jonathan Isaacson finishes because he sort of puts these up there and assumes everybody knows. We all know who Charles Darwin is, but he kind of assumes everybody knows who Joseph Schumpeter is. I had to actually Google this one back some time ago. Charles Darwin is credited with survival of the fittest. Actually, it's unfortunate that that's the interpretation, because what Charles Darwin really said was the most adaptable survive. And I think that's key to our future. The more adaptable you are, the more likely you will survive and prosper. And Joseph Schumpeter, his claim to fame is actually that he took a look at all the economic cycles and said what economic cycles can't account for if you use them to project the future is the role of the entrepreneur. And he would look at that and say, Stephen Jobs was a great example of that. In a really difficult time, he actually had a big enough impact to change the numbers and change an industry. So don't get too caught up in the economic numbers. Make yourself that entrepreneur that changes for your business, your response to those cycles. So, questions? Discussion?
Can you share that document?
The presentation? We occasionally share pieces of it. We don't like to share the whole thing, in part because there's a lot of work that goes into this, but more importantly because it quickly becomes outdated. So, you know, we constantly are updating the information, and it's all in keeping the information fresh and interpreting the information as it occurs.
You mentioned adfolios and things like that are on a decline. That's been a pretty big staple for a lot of promotional companies. And with the differences in tablets and stuff like that, it's stuff like, I had a client who was buying lots of iPad things, but that was for his staff. In terms of a giveaway, I can give a pad of paper to anybody or a folio, but I can't
And-
So how are you accounting for that?
And the numbers that we're seeing, and we're a relatively significant Padfolio supplier. So we have a pretty good base of numbers to look at. We'd actually challenge you on the statement that anybody can use a pad of paper. When you're now gifting an audience, oftentimes because of the number that have an iPad, yes, they want the pad of paper, but they also have to have a place to put the iPad. So what we've done with our Padfolio business, and what we're screaming to do more and more of in the future, is make every Padfolio account for an iPad, a place to put the iPad, a place to store the iPad.
You don't think other pads are going to compete with the iPad?
Sure, sure. But, so you have to address the sizes. So you have to have a 7-inch, you have to have a 10-inch. Generally, within the Padfolios that we're doing, we're designing them. Within Padfolios alone, we're really designing them around a 10, but they accommodate a 7. So we do things that make it flexible to do both. When we're doing the device-specific pieces, we do things specific for the 7, specific for the 10, actually specific for the 7 Google, and specific for the iPad mini, which are 2 different sizes, the camera holes in 2 different places, all that. But the overriding message is, and you should think about it beyond Padfolios, think about other products impacted. You're going to find it harder and harder to sell those products unless they also somehow address the use of the iPad or a tablet. I use iPad because they're so dominant in their market share, but they need to accommodate a tablet in some fashion. And our numbers are pretty strong. And it's amazing how quickly, though, they've gotten strong in just 2 years. We just did a forecast meeting last week, and we're looking at our Padfolio numbers and trying carefully to manage the declines we're seeing in traditional Padfolios and the increases we're seeing in Padfolios that also accommodate a tablet.
And another question, you're talking about entrepreneurs and the declining ability of China to manufacture. Do you not think some of the manufacturing will shift back to be domestic?
I think some will. I don't think it all will. I think there are many types of manufacturing that, frankly, the U.S. worker isn't all that interested in doing anymore, or the Canadian worker wouldn't be that interested in doing anymore either. When your standard of living increases, the attractiveness of certain types of manufacture, like in our case, cut and sew, makes it a little hard to attract your labor force. So we certainly are taking the tact of looking for other low-cost markets to go to. But there are certainly products that are coming back. Either to the U.S., I think there's probably more migrating to Mexico, which now actually has a more attractive total economic cost than China. So. Anything else? Any other questions?
Hi, Bob. Couple things about the next generation and how that's going to impact the way we all do business. So I find it interesting. I haven't experienced yet the whole text thing directly. I mean, I've had customers text me on occasion. I mean, my cell phone has always been on my business card, and I've always encouraged people, hey, reach out to me anytime. So on occasion, definitely. I guess I don't totally see how text is going to replace an email because it's still so limited in the amount of space. So I find that kind of interesting. I mean, I can see it functioning more as a, hey, can you contact me? Hey, need a quick quote on, 20,000, whatever. But then there's still, yes, at that point I would presumably have to respond with an email because there might be other information that's associated with more than just a price.
Right.
So you really think that?
Well, I think the things that you can move via some kind, that sort of mobile communication versus going back, versus sending an email, will continue to increase. And I guess it depends on the nature of the relationship that you have. The gentleman I referred to out in San Francisco, he does not, I've never received an email from met him face to face. He actually came to Boston and went through our facility. He's a texter. He texted last week. He wanted contact information for somebody and expects that. Had I said, here you go, Zach, I'm sending it via email with the V card attached, his response.
Right. But the contact might in the end still be giving him, and then it becomes the data exchange.
Right. Right.
Still ultimately
Moving, there's no doubt, at least at this point in technology, if you want to move significant data, you're going to be sending emails. And my daughters, both of them both in their education and now with my other daughter who's teaching, when they're moving big files, they're moving those via email. But they would never send a note saying, you know, I'll meet you here, we're going to do this, this. You know, they just don't, email's not a form of communication for them in that sort of mode. So it's just it's a trend and it's a change. It's a change that has caught me off guard, as I indicated. I'm surprised how much expectation there is to customers who will text rather than email. It makes perfect sense to me depending on the age of the customer. And the one I'm talking about is, I would guess, 27 or 28. So it's right in that age zone. So. Other questions?
This is comment about Facebook. I've always struggled, and I'm not 30 age demographic, and I struggle myself with Facebook with adding clients who want to add themselves to my Facebook with all my friends and stuff on there. I have nothing but hide, but it to me is just it's a hard line. It's a fine line.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's separate presentations done by people who are much more qualified. Yeah. And they'll do nothing but talk about social media
like
and how to do it.
Versus Facebook, like to me, there's two platforms for it.
But two very different platforms. You know, so in Facebook, certainly fine to set up a professional page, where that's where your customers connect with you. I personally think there's an advantage to having your customers actually know more about you personally. I guess you have to. It depends on the content that's on your Facebook page.
It's just sometimes you never know what others are posting.
But
they can see once you're friends, right? So
right.
It's not so much yourself.
The relationship is enhanced and moves more rapidly, I believe, when you share more personal information and not just business information. And I previously didn't. I was one of those that, like, if I didn't know somebody, if I hadn't met them, I didn't accept them as a friend. I threw that out 2 years ago. Because there's so many who use it as a networking connection. That's how they make their contact with you. I accept, if they're in the industry, I accept them, whether I've met them or not.
In your busy day, where do you find enough time to communicate with all these people?
Well, I do a lot of Facebook at night and on weekends. But I also, because I'm getting my Facebook feed through my cell phone, through my iPhone, there are plenty of people that connect on Facebook during the day, and I respond to them during the day because they're using Facebook as that connection point. So it's just another way of connecting. So it's, to be honest, it's not that. I know that's the natural. It's not that time consuming. It's less. You will build a relationship faster via that social media with less effort than if you try to make a point to go out and meet people everywhere. And I certainly still think there's an incredible value in face-to-face communication. But you can build relationships very quickly on Facebook. And it doesn't take a tremendous amount of time investment. Because for the most part, what people are doing is they're linking, they're connecting, and they're watching stuff. So I stream, you know, I'll take things off the Gemline page and put it onto my page in case they haven't friended Gemline, although most of them by now have friended Gemline. It's certainly quicker for me to do that than to email a Gemline promotion to a list of 40, 50, 60 customers. Again, as little as 2 years ago, I certainly was more flexible with our sales force that you could do it if you wanted to. This year, we got our last guy, our last convert. Many of them still don't use it very much, but more and more are getting drawn into it because they can see that they're losing an aspect of their competitive edge with new entrants to the market who are Facebook savvy and using it as a tool. So. Other questions?
How do you deal with all the employees? What level of permission do you permit Facebook being and following online?
We trust their judgment completely. Plenty of, certainly I see, because I'm Facebook friends with most of our inside sales team, all the inside sales team are on Facebook during the day. They're using it as a tool. They're making a lot of connections that way. I think increasingly we'll see those walls come down where you don't want people on Facebook during the workday, because in our industry certainly, it's a completely appropriate tool for linking with customers. More importantly is how do you manage what their messaging is on Facebook and making sure it's consistent with the message that your corporation wants to put out there. So we haven't dealt with any horrible examples, but we're certainly judicious about what, we ask our people to be judicious about what they put out on Facebook. Absolutely.
And seen examples of that where people have made messages from a government employee, they get in trouble.
When I post things, I often go out to our Facebook manager, and I ask her to read it before I post it. Because sometimes I tend to like to go out and have some fun, and sometimes I'm posting things that nothing terribly embarrassing, but I ask her to look at it and say, it's not going on the Gemline page, it's going on my page, but it is going to a Gemline audience. Is this okay? Not yet to have her tell me I've crossed the line, but I'm pretty careful about the line. So.
It's sort of weird because it's sort of like Big Brother's watching now, though. I mean, or you're vulnerable to be criticized because you're putting it all out there, and when it's your economic view, your business view, that vulnerability is enhanced because it could affect your income.
Absolutely. If ever in the U.S. during this last election, if you were following certain people on Facebook, if ever you saw that sensitivity, you saw it during the election. I'm sure, Carol, you probably saw a lot of that. People who post their political views and then, I stay away from those things. But you have to be much more sensitive to that. You may alienate some customers who learn more about you and decide it's things they really didn't want to learn. So.
I have a question about Facebook in regards to, in regards to Facebook as far as employees are concerned, like where do you draw the line as far as, I have nieces and nephews come over for dinner and all they're doing is during dinner is on their BlackBerry or on their iPhone or whatever, all they're doing is talking to their friends. So in the workplace, like how do you, it's important it's an important part of business going forward, but how do you separate the personal versus business aspect of Facebook in the workplace? Like how much time is actually wasted on social media that actually has nothing to do with business in the workplace as opposed to not?
Well, I certainly, again, I'll refer specifically to our situation. The fact that I'm friended with so many of the inside salespeople and basically all the external sales organization, I would notice it if I felt like they were spending time doing things that they shouldn't be doing during work hours. I've not seen evidence of that, to be honest.
Do they have a separate page for personal versus business?
Only a few do. But even the ones that don't have that separate page, if they're on it during business hours, they're usually promoting something about Gemline or communicating with the customer. If they're on it after hours, they're talking about their kids, they're talking about what they're doing, they're talking about a concert they're going to. But I don't see that happen during work hours. Other questions? All right, thank you very much.